So let's get into our last part, where we look at where humans fall in the grand scheme of classifying and identifying organisms. If we look at how things have changed over time in this table here, we look all the way back to 2 billion years ago when we have the domain Eukarya, which is the domain, that's the category where all eukaryotic cells fall into. And we see that characteristic pop up of a membrane-bound nucleus that makes this unique from the prokaryotes like bacteria. 600 million years ago, we see kingdom Animalia split from the rest of the group, where now we have multicellular, motile, meaning we can move, and heterotrophic, meaning we're eating other organisms, develop. 540 million years ago, we see phylum Chordata, that sometime in our life history we develop a dorsal tubular nerve cord, a notochord, and pharyngeal pouches. These are characteristics that don't have to necessarily be kept, but they pop up at some point during the life history of that organism. Millions of years go by and we get to 120 million years ago, where we find class Mammalia. These are the first vertebrates with hair and mammary glands. 60 million years ago, order Primates splits from the mammals, where we now have a well-developed brain, and we've adapted to life in the trees. And it was only 7 million years ago that we see the first human-like organisms, the family Hominidae, that has adapted to be upright and bipedal, meaning we walk on two legs. Even Hominidae wasn't quite as human as you would think, and it wasn't until 3 million years ago that we even had our genus pop up, the genus Homo, where we have an even more developed brain and tool use and making of tools happening. But even that's not specific enough to just consider us. We're species Homo sapiens. We didn't pop up until about 0.1 million years ago. That's where we look at modern humans, where we have speech centers that are well developed in our brains, in addition to all of the other things we've already talked about. We're relatively new in the grand scheme of things. Now, I mentioned domain Eukarya in the very beginning of the last slide, but I didn't quite go into what that means. Domains are the largest umbrellas of categorizing living things. So if we look at Eukarya, that includes everything that is one or more cells and that has a membrane-bound nucleus. That includes plants, fungus, animals, many protists of all different types, all fall in Eukarya. There's also domain Bacteria and domain Archaea. Both bacteria and archaea are prokaryotes, but they do have some key differences in how they organize themselves that split them into two separate groups. We're not going to get into domain bacteria and archaea, so we'll leave them at that. Let's focus on the humans for this, and to do that we need to introduce the primates. The primates is a much larger group than just humans, and it includes any of these any organisms that fall within these characteristics. We need to have an opposable thumb. We need to have stereoscopic vision, meaning we have depth perception. We can tell how deep something is or how far away something is. We have a relatively well-developed brain. We don't have very many offspring, usually just a single birth, although possibly twins. And we've increased how much time we spend parenting those offspring. So we've shifted away from having as many offspring as possible and hoping for the best to having very few offspring and investing a lot of time and energy into them. There's also an emphasis on learned behavior and social interactions. No longer were we solitary, just trying to figure things out on our own. Now, with the primates, we can learn from others. We can watch someone do an activity or make a tool and then copy that behavior from them. And there's two major groups called suborders of primates, the prosimians and the anthropoids. The prosimians are the more ancient of these and includes the lemurs, tarsiers, and lorises. We fall in with the anthropoids, which includes monkeys, apes, and humans. We can then split the apes into two groups based on their continent, the Asian apes and African apes. The Asian apes include gibbons and orangutans, and the African apes include gorillas and chimpanzees. We split along with the African apes, with the chimpanzee being our next closest cousin. So let's talk about us and chimpanzees and find the relationship between us, find the similarities, but also some of the key differences between us and them. If we look at the spine, we both have a spine, but the shape is different. For us, our spine exits the center of our skull, whereas in the ape, it exits from the back. We have an S-shaped spine, whereas the chimpanzee has more of a C shape. Our pelvis is shaped like a bowl, whereas the chimpanzee pelvis is longer and narrow. When we look at our legs, our femurs angle in towards the knees, whereas with the chimpanzee, there's angle out. Our knee can support a lot more weight than the knee of a chimpanzee. We're upright, so our knees have to be able to withstand all the weight of our body up over the knees, whereas the chimpanzee spends its time in trees as well and doesn't rely on walking around on two legs as much. If we look at the foot, the human foot has an arch in it, whereas the chimpanzee foot is flat. There is no arch. So let's look at the family tree of primates. So if we're looking at this image here, we're basically looking at how do we relate to other organisms. And so the closer you are and the shorter your branches are, the more closely related you are. So humans and chimpanzees, both hominins, and we split relatively recent. We're looking at under 10 million years ago. If we go back further, we get to when we split from the gorillas. Another hominin, closer to 10 million years ago. We look at when we split from the Asian side with the orangutans, and we're looking at just over 10 million years. With the gibbons, we're looking at about 15 million. Old world monkeys, like rhesus monkeys, would be even further back to about 35 million years ago. New world monkeys like capuchins is over 40 million years ago. And then finally, to those prosimians, the tarsiers and the lemurs, you're looking at about 60 million, give or take, for both of those groups. So our relationship to the lemur, the most common ancestor we have between us and lemurs, would be from about 60 million years ago. But we want to look at the hominins, things that are more human-like. It's not just Homo sapiens, it also includes other species from the genus Homo and other close relatives from closely related genuses. But there's some main characteristics that we have to meet in order to be considered a hominin. You need to be bipedal, again meaning you're up on two legs. You have a flatter face with a more pronounced chin, and your brain size is larger in comparison to other organisms. The first hominins that we have evidence from are from about 6 to 7 million years ago. Now, I'm not going to expect you to remember all of these names, but let's just go through some of these very quickly. We have Sahelanthropus chadensis from 7 million years ago, and we include things from the genus Orinin and Ardipithecus. So our hominins split from the rest of the ape line about 7 million years ago. Another group that popped up from the hominins about 3 million years ago is Australopithecines. Australopithecines, or the genus Australopithecus, had slight frames for some cases, and others had more robust frames with bigger jaws for feeding on plants. But they walked upright, and they had these interesting proportions for their limbs. So while they did walk upright, they still had ape-like limbs where their arms were long and their legs were shorter. They also still had a relatively small brain. One of the most popular or most famous from this group is Lucy. She was from the species Australopithecus africanus. She had a larger brain and is the most likely candidate for being the early Homo genus's ancestor. And so this is what she would look like. This is a recreation based on the fossils that they found of her. So if you look at her, you can see how she does look kind of like a blend between a human and a modern day ape. She walks upright, her feet look somewhat human-like, but her arms are still long and somewhat ape-like in their proportion. Her face still looks ape-like, but she has mammary glands that are more pronounced, and she holds herself looking more like a human. We get closer to our own species and we get finally into the genus Homo. In order to be considered from part of the genus Homo, the brain size has to be even larger, 600 cc's or more. There has to be evidence of tool use, and the jaw and teeth are going to resemble more like modern day humans. Some of the early representatives from this genus include Homo habilis and Homo erectus, and more later ones include the Neanderthals and Cro-Magnons. So if we look at the time scale, here's our Sahelanthropus back here. Here's our Ardipithecus, getting closer. We see Australopithecus, there's two species here, Afarensis and Africanus, and Sediba. And then finally we get into the Homo genus where we get Habilis, Ergaster, Erectus, and Heidelbergensis. And finally we introduce the Neanderthals before we get to our modern day selves, Homo sapiens. As we follow this time frame, we look at the skulls and we see that we are moving towards what looks like a modern day skull. This right here looks more ape-like. But as we move this way, the face starts to flatten out, the jaw starts to change, and the brain case, the cranium, starts to enlarge. So over time, we're seeing that shift in characteristics that become less and less ancient ape-like and more modern human-like. So if we look at Homo habilis, we're looking at about 2 million years ago. We're seeing that there's a large enough brain to have a speech area. We've become omnivorous, meaning we're hunters and gatherers. There's evidence of primitive tools, and they may have had culture. Moving towards Homo erectus, where we've gone from about 2 to 0.3 million years ago, the brain has gotten larger, the face has flattened more with a more projected nose, we're standing taller and more erect. We have a stride in our step, and we may have come from Africa into Europe and Asia. The tools have become more advanced, and there's evidence of use of fire. By this point, we may have had actual language in place, although rudimentary. Here we just see some of those fossils from Homo ergaster. Finally, we get to the modern humans, our species, Homo sapiens. The current hypothesis is the out of Africa hypothesis, or the replacement model. This is the one that's most widely accepted. It proposes that modern day humans evolved from archaic humans only in Africa, and then through migration moved to Asia and Europe, where they replaced other more ancient species about 100,000 years ago. So this is the idea that Homo erectus originally migrated out from Africa into Asia and Europe. However, eventually modern day humans, Homo sapiens, stayed within Africa, but also immigrated to Asia and Europe. And when they did that, they outcompeted the rest of the human-like species, and so the rest of the human-like species died out. In modern day, there are no other species within the genus Homo. We're the only ones. So this is the time frame that they're looking at, that we were in East Africa about 2 million years ago. Just under 2 million years ago, we made it into Eurasia, and at about 1.5 million years ago, roughly, we made it into China and Indonesia. Neanderthals were one of those other Homo species that we wiped out. These were discovered in Germany, and they lived about 200,000 years ago. They had massive brow ridges, and their nose, jaws, and teeth did protrude forward. They didn't really have a chin, and their forehead sloped forward and was low. The Cro-Magnons lived about 40 to 100,000 years ago, and the Cro-Magnons are technically part of Homo sapiens. They're much more modern, and there's evidence of advanced culture, including art, tools, and possibly language. There's evidence that they were cooperative hunters as well. So we just see some evidence here, although it is an artistic interpretation. When we look at the modern day human now, we see that there's large variation between populations, and we do kind of name these things like ethnicities and race, although these variations are more adaptations to local environments. They don't hold too much water when it comes to determining other important things like intelligence and whatnot. It's just, how did you adapt to the environment that you're in? So we look at something like skin color. It ranges from dark to light. This is due to how much UV light is present at areas like the equator versus up more towards the Arctic Circle. If you live in an area that has very intense UV light, having darker skin is an adaptation that protects you against sun damage. Whereas if you live very, very far north, where there isn't as much sun and it's not as intense, you need lighter skin to actually get a little bit of UV light so that you can convert things like vitamin D. Body shape is another variation we see. We see that where in areas that are colder, individuals tend to have a bulkier build. And in colder regions, we also see that the limbs, the digits, and the ears are shorter. This is because you're at risk of losing heat in a colder area, and so staying bulkier and having shorter digits and ears and limbs can help you retain body heat. In today's world, though, we're highly globalized, and so these variations, while at one point were advantageous, are simply leftover characteristics that we can enjoy when it comes to experiencing the diversity of humans today.